We are very pleased to invite you to this presentation, which will form two halves. I'm going to start by featuring selecting studies, and then my colleague is going to deal with assessing methodological limitations. So we have no actual or potential conflicts of interest in relation to this presentation. And just a reminder that this is a part of a series of 8. It's the third, with 5 more to come in the new year. So study selection is a key point in the systematic review process, and that applies equally within qualitative synthesis. It's usually that point where you can take stock of the searches you've done, excuse me, whether those are database searches or supplementary searches. And this involves usually 2 reviewers selecting articles that meet the inclusion criteria. And as Porritt has said, it's essential that this process is both transparent and reproducible. And it's very helpful to have as a frame of reference the idea of either ruling in or ruling out. And although these in practice may sound similar, when you're ruling in, this is at that point where you have the full texts of the articles, and you're seeing the extent to which they address the questions that are being posed for the review. But ruling out is an earlier process that you do at a title and abstract stage, where you're speedily and efficiently eliminating papers that don't address the review questions. And the reason for putting interesting in there is it can be very tempting to get sidetracked, but you have to be very precise in terms of the application of your inclusion criteria. Now, because you're doing these 2 processes of ruling out and ruling in, it means that you're using the inclusion and exclusion criteria in a slightly different way. And indeed, you may have a shorter set of criteria for the abstracts than you do when it comes to the full text. Now, if you look at our chapter in the Cochrane handbook on the qualitative studies, you will see that the process is more complex than is required for reviews of trials. And this is because you're not just making an assessment according to the relevance of the material, but you're also looking for the fitness for purpose. And this means that you need to have a number of criteria, some of which are general criteria and others of which are review specific. And the objective is to end up with a manageable synthesis. It's no good having hundreds of studies if you're not going to be able to bring those together into a sensible collective, sensible product. But again, the guiding principle is transparency and being able to account for all stages of the decisions, but importantly also stating their rationale. Because it's very easy but wrong to just copy the methods used in other reviews without thinking about their rationale. And there's some very useful contributions in a series on QES and guidelines to which Sue Down contributed, stating that the studies should be based on, or study selection should be based on the predetermined inclusion and exclusion criteria from the protocol, but the objective is to limit the number of papers selected to a manageable amount. And although this may seem at first a little strange, if we think about it, the number of trials that are available is quite finite in the sense that they are expensive to commission, whereas qualitative research could be done as part of a PhD and is frequently done so, and so they could be in theory more plentiful. So we need to think about their not just their quantity but also their contribution, and that's an extra thing that we consider. And so when doing this in the context of Cochrane, then we want to ensure that our studies cover a full range of contexts and a full range of the participants from the study populations to match our review question, our target population, if you like. But differences with selection for quantitative studies also exist, because it's not essential to identify and include every available relevant study. And again, this may seem a little alien to some of you, but this is because our overall purpose in a quality synthesis is what we call interpretive rather than predictive. And so we would expect that transferable concepts or themes, because they represent aspects of human behavior, may be found consistently across a wide range of participants and contexts. And so the number of studies that we include in QES will therefore depend on such things as the variety of concepts identified, the range of sociocultural contexts that we're including, and also on the degree of agreement between studies on the emerging concepts and themes. So here's a typical study selection process. First of all, you apply inclusion and exclusion criteria to the titles and abstracts. And what you're doing here is ruling out, you're eliminating studies that clearly meet one or more exclusion criteria. Then you retrieve the full text, and it's at this point that a decision about whether you're going to have a sampling strategy or not comes to play. And then for the remaining studies, you look at the full texts to see whether they meet your inclusion and exclusion, and this is the point at which you're ruling in. And the idea is to include studies that meet all your inclusion criteria and no exclusion criteria. And to that, we could add, and also meet your sampling criteria. You exclude studies from the QES if they fall short of the criteria, and then finally you end up with your set of accepted studies. And in the forthcoming chapter by Heather Ames and Jane Noyes and myself, we try and show these two different models of reviewing in a QES context. On the right-hand side, you have perhaps the more familiar model of the comprehensive approach to sampling, and this very much resembles that you will have encountered in an effects review. But on the left-hand side, you can see an approach to theoretical or purposeful sampling, where you review the characteristics of the studies, not the findings of the studies, that's very important, but the characteristics of the studies, and make decisions on what the variables of significance are, and then you use that to inform your sampling strategy. And it's very important here to have the take-home message that we're actually, just as we were earlier in presentation 2, we were searching for diversity. Here we're now sampling for diversity. So here's an example linked to the earlier presentation. We use the SPICE structure, but this time we're using it for our inclusion and exclusion criteria rather than for our search strategy. So with the setting we face, are we going to have a universal setting, so all countries, if we think geographically? Is it going to be criterion based? For example, will it just be lower and middle income countries? Or will there be some form of selection? So will we be perhaps selecting extreme examples? So perhaps in the most affluent countries and the least affluent countries, or those with the most homogeneous population, or those with the most diverse population. So that would be another instance where we think of sampling and its potential. Similarly, with perspectives, are we looking at a single perspective, perhaps of patients themselves, multiple perspectives, including perhaps caregivers, family members, health professionals, or are we interested in all perspectives? And again, if our decision inclines towards trying to include multiple or all perspectives, we may again wish to contemplate sampling. Again, with the phenomenon of interest, are we looking at a homogeneous, a single population intervention or exposure? Are we looking at multiple populations, interventions or exposures? And again, we may wish to apply sampling. Comparison, are there meaningful subgroups that theoretically we can pre-identify, that where the intervention or the exposure may be more important, or Are there particular groups that are likely to have very pronounced effects or very subdued effects in terms of the impact of the phenomenon of interest? And then when it comes to evaluation, we need to think about what sort of data we're including. Are we going for properly formulated qualitative studies? So those that use established methods of qualitative data collection and qualitative data analysis. Are we broadening to include qualitative data, perhaps from mixed method studies or from qualitative data from open-ended survey responses? We have decisions on that. Are we going to include verbatim extracts only, so the expressions of participants? Are we also going to include as our data the observations of authors? And indeed, are we going to make decisions based on the richness of the account? So are we going to discard particularly thin accounts that are less likely to generate new perspectives? So you can see that sampling can be brought in at all of these questions, at all of these stages of the question components. And when it comes to study selection, we answer a number of standard questions. Does the study fall within our time period of interest? Is it within our included and specified languages? Does it match the population that we intend? Does it include the phenomenon or phenomena that we want to include in our review question? Is it clearly of the study design that we've said is eligible? And within the study design, does it actually include qualitative data? So we wouldn't be interested, for example, in a summary article that didn't have any access to the data, whether in the form of verbatim extracts or observations from the authors based and grounded in the data. We often get asked how many sifters should we have in the process, and this is really very much dependent on the resources you have available. The ideal is a double sift for all stages, but the more practical is often to think of where the biggest risks lie to the overall rigor of the review. And there are various options here, for example, so doing double sift just at particular stages of the process, doing a single sift plus a random sample, doing a double sift during the pilot and using that as a training and sensitivity exercise, and then once you're happy with the inter-rate reliability, using a single sifter. And increasingly, we see the addition of a final option, which is to use a sorting algorithm by relevance of a text mining function to check and corroborate the results from a human sifter. There's various tools of software that you can use for the selection process. Cochrane obviously favors Covidence, and we find this works equally well for qualitative syntheses. But some of you, through resource issues or through preference, might prefer to use your own technologies. So here we have an example from an Excel spreadsheet. We've imported the references from our reference management database into Excel. We've constructed drop-down menus for our different PICO elements or SPICE elements, and we've maximized the windows so that we can see the whole abstract while making our judgments. So we're going to just briefly pause for a poll now. So we're going to ask Dario to run the poll of which software is your preferred option for study selection. Thank you. We're fast approaching nearly 200 responses. So this is going to be one of the richest surveys that has taken place on this particular aspect. Got a little bit of stability now, which is always helpful at one of these seminars. Right. Okay. So if we share the results now, as Dario's done, so we can see that most of you use homemade solutions, either Sifting from EndNote or Excel or some other option. And on another occasion, we'd love to find out what those options are. A slight preference for Rayan, which of course is a freely accessible software. And then we've got Confidence, which we would expect to figure prominently given the Cochrane allegiance of these workshops. And then 14% have used something else. So thank you for participating in that. We'll now move on. So some take-home messages here. We find it really helpful to think of the sequencing of your eligibility criteria. So although we formatted them in the SPICE order, personally, I find that I can make my quickest judgment on whether it's qualitative research or not. Now, that will obviously depend on your own expertise. It may well be that your quickest decision is about, is it on the phenomenon of interest or is it the perspective? But give some thought to the order, because that can save seconds for every single record. And when you add that up, that can be a not inconsiderable saving. The second thing is to remember that your objective with the title and abstract screening is to rule out. So what you're looking for are things that are definitely out. Now, obviously, you still have to be risk averse, because you don't want to throw, as we say in English, the baby out with the bathwater. So it's important, if there's any doubt, to continue to keep the title and abstract through to the next stage. But if there is a clear reason for excluding it, then that should be implemented. But when you get to the full text screening, you're moving in the other direction, because you're dealing with smaller and richer data sources. And the other thing worth saying is sometimes you see that people have both an include and a full text, include for definite includes and full text for those that can be resolved by looking at the full text. And this may be useful, but in practice, they both equate to the equivalent of an in, because you're not making the definitive judgment until you actually look at the full text anyway. However, we do still find it useful to have this distinction, particularly if we want to prioritize the probables over the possibles, so the includes over the full text queries, because that might give us some articles that we can start to pilot on, to start data extracting, or if we're doing a rapid review, it may push the most relevant articles to the top of our list, and then we come round to the possibles later. So depending on whether you're doing this in a purist sense or a pragmatic sense, include and full text can either both equal in, or they can be a useful distinction between probables and possibles. So the case for sampling's warranted theoretically in that it mirrors a lot of qualitative research. A number of authors suggest that we can learn from primary qualitative research. And if we do so, then we open up an extremely rich toolkit, as described by Patton here. We have all of these methods that could potentially be used for sampling in a qualitative synthesis. And in fact, in our forthcoming handbook, we look at each of these and map it to an application of when you might use this particular strategy in your qualitative synthesis. But there are problems with sampling the literature. And key difficulties, as have been identified by Atkins, is we don't know about the total population unless we actually construct a sampling frame that includes all relevant studies. So you can see that the search for a purposive sample could be equally exhaustive to that for a comprehensive search. It's just that we then make decisions about which studies to sample from. And we have to recognize too that sampling papers isn't like sampling people. If you go and interview someone, then they won't know what others have said before. If you sample papers, then they've had the opportunity, whether they've taken it or not, to actually see what other people have previously said. And authors have a vested interest in highlighting things that haven't been present in other papers. So they're not independent informants like in primary qualitative research. It's helpful to think of the purpose for our review. We tend to use purposive sampling far more when we're doing something more interpretive or configurative, as the epicenter refer to it. And this is illustrated, as we've done previously, with the idea of piling stones upon stones for the aggregative, where each study counts, or thinking about the missing tiles on a mosaic and how we could still make an overall interpretation, even if individual studies are missing with an interpretive review. So we need to ask these questions. Is the review going to be aggregative or interpretive? To what extent does theory play a part? Because that may then govern our decisions on what to sample and how. And also, how important are differences in context? So if we're doing an international review, it obviously becomes very important to ensure that there's representation of diverse countries and diverse socio-demographic characteristics. And it's nicely illustrated just briefly in this illustration. So in a configurative, in an aggregative review, we would need to see the missing piece in order to interpret it. In an interpretive review, we would be able to work out that missing piece. And indeed, if we want confirmation, here it is. So conventional systematic review methodology uses one method of limiting the number of papers. This is by having very tightly defined criteria. But interpretive reviews are more fluid in the sense that you get a greater idea of what you need to sample as the picture from the studies becomes clearer. So in terms of sampling strategies, we can just think of these at two poles, if you like, that for an aggregative review where we're going to include all studies, then we conduct scoping to find out the extent of it and to put the bounds around our overall review topic. But in an interpretive review, we can conduct scoping, but really to see what falls within the sampling frame and to construct a preliminary sampling frame within which we can then explore variation. And we're going to, in our forthcoming Cochrane QES handbook, show you the different methods of sampling, but just as an early attempt at this, you can see here an attempt by myself to map methods of sampling to particular methods of synthesis when you would most use them. There have been 3 studies now, 2 of which are highlighted here, that have looked at the effect of purposive sampling. In the first case, it said, don't necessarily think of this as just being labor saving, because indeed constructing the sampling might take time in itself. But it does provide an opportunity to ensure that you have multiple perspectives around your line of argument. And on the right-hand side, a very important review by Heather Ames, which looks at criteria for selecting studies that include, for example, the context, so the LMICs. Importantly, and we'll come on to this, the data richness and also closeness to the synthesis objectives. So this was a way of narrowing 79 studies down to nearly half that amount. When can I stop sampling? Well, there's 3 markers, and we discussed these briefly in the searching session. When we reach theoretical saturation, but we need to sample for dissonance and diversity. So is the stuff that we've missed, is it likely to contribute, in which case we put in more effort? Bibliographic sufficiency, when the same references keep coming up, an idea that we've saturated our sample, or when you've had no more questions to answer. And then in terms of reporting sampling, with our final slide here, that it's very important, whatever sampling strategy we decide to use, we must justify it. We must clearly demonstrate that it matches to our chosen method of synthesis, and we must describe fully how it was implemented. And it's hoped that by using alternatives to the comprehensive sampling that has become the default, rightly so in reviews of effectiveness, that we will start to use more informed approaches to sampling that meet the needs of the research synthesis. So I'm going to pause there for questions. I'm sure that a number have arisen, so I'm going to stop sharing my slides at this point. So over to Kate and Jane. Kate.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and good afternoon, everybody, and delighted that you could be with us this afternoon. There's been some great questions coming up in the chat box, as you might expect, Andrew, and Jane and I have covered off a couple of those, but just a couple for you now. So Marshall Dozier asked, he said he noted the use of sift rather than screen in your terminology, and is this significant for your review?
Well, the answer is no. It's probably looseness of slides,
Okay.
but I think the important point behind it all is that some people tend to think of the searching and the sifting stroke screening as being a separate process, but actually if you think of your inclusion and exclusion criteria, they should be seen as one, that some things that you may end up sifting out, if we can use that in a non-technical sense, sifting out through your search strategy, and in other cases you may be needing to sift through your screening process. So I don't think my explanation has helped in the confusion of terminology, but just to say it's a whole package. Some of things will be able to be done technically, and other things will need to be done by the human reviewers.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Great to have that clarification. And then final question before we move over to Jane's slides. Federico Baptista asked, what's the percentage of studies that we should include in the consistency check before we move to title and abstract screening? Do you have a view on that?
Well, it's very hard to pin it down, because the first question is that you should do as much as your resources allow, and most people, like the questioner and myself, come from how little can we get away with. I would say that in the context of Cochrane rapid reviews, and we've still got to test this for QES specifically, but they make recommendations of 10 to 20%. That's in a rapid review context, so we would think that that is a minimum that we definitely shouldn't fall below, and then with it being a full QES, we should probably be aiming for figures that are superior to that.